By late December 1944, the world thought the Battle of the Bulge was over. Bastogne had been relieved. The German advance had stalled. The headlines were already moving on. Inside Allied headquarters, no one shared that confidence. The map suggested stability. The German breakthrough had stopped moving west, but to Dwight D. Eisenhower, the situation remained dangerously unfinished. Tens of thousands of German troops were still packed into a jagged salient in the frozen Ardennes, battered, low on fuel, but very much alive. As long as they remained intact, they threatened the entire Allied front. This was no longer a battle of heroics. It was a problem of decisions. General Patton believed the Germans had overreached and could be destroyed if the Allies closed fast enough. Speed to him was everything. Every hour of delay meant enemy units slipping away to fight again. Bernard Montgomery saw the same battlefield and drew the opposite conclusion. Winter weather, icy roads, and broken terrain made haste dangerous. He believed control mattered more than speed, and that a careful advance would avoid turning victory into chaos. Eisenhower stood between them. As supreme commander of a coalition army, he chose caution. He did not order a reckless encirclement or demand annihilation at any cost. Instead, he aimed to restore the Allied line and push the Germans back east, even if that meant allowing them to retreat under pressure. On paper, it was a sound decision. What Eisenhower could not control was the enemy. Because while the Allies were prepared to let the German army withdraw, Adolf Hitler was not. Retreat was forbidden, and when retreat is delayed, denied, and forced through frozen roads under fire, it ceases to be a maneuver. It becomes a collapse. This is not the story of a trap that was sprung. It's the story of a retreat that was never meant to turn into a slaughter, but did anyway. Eisenhower's decision after Bastogne was shaped less by ambition than by responsibility. He was not commanding a single army, but a coalition stretched across Western Europe, fighting in the worst winter conditions in decades. His job was not to win glory in the Ardennes. It was to keep the war from unraveling. The immediate danger was no longer a German breakthrough to Antwerp. It was instability. The Bulge had bent the Allied line into a dangerous arc, straining supply routes and command coordination. Eisenhower's priority was to straighten that line as quickly and safely as possible. That meant pressure, not pursuit. Eisenhower understood the temptation of encirclement. He knew Patton wanted to close the jaws and destroy the German army outright, but the risks were real. Allied logistics were already stretched thin. Roads were clogged with snow and ice. Air power, normally decisive, was unreliable in the winter weather. A failed encirclement would not just cost time, it could cost the initiative. There was also the alliance to consider. Eisenhower could not simply force British and American commanders into a high-risk operation without consensus. Montgomery's forces held the northern shoulder. If they advanced too fast and suffered heavy losses, the political fallout could be as damaging as any military setback. So Eisenhower accepted a controlled outcome. If German forces withdrew east under sustained pressure, that was acceptable, provided the Bulge was reduced and the front restored. He was willing to let a beaten enemy retreat rather than gamble the entire campaign on a single decisive blow. It was a choice rooted in caution in coalition warfare. What Eisenhower did not anticipate was how little control anyone would have once the German withdrawal finally began. On the northern shoulder of the Bulge, responsibility fell to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. During the height of the German breakthrough, Eisenhower had temporarily placed the American First Army under Montgomery's command, giving him control of the most fragile part of the front. Montgomery approached the situation the way he always did, deliberately. He believed the crisis had been caused by overextension and poor coordination, and he was determined not to repeat those mistakes. Before attacking south toward the base of the Bulge, he insisted on reorganizing units, securing supply lines, and waiting for conditions to improve. In his view, speed without control invited disaster, especially in winter terrain that favored entrenched defenders. From Montgomery's perspective, his caution was saving lives. His forces were advancing methodically, applying steady pressure and preventing another German breakthrough. To him, this was exactly what Eisenhower wanted: stability. To others, it looked like hesitation. While Montgomery prepared, German units began slipping east in fragments, not in good order, but fast enough to avoid complete encirclement. Every day the northern advance moved slowly was another day the escape routes remained partially open. This was not obstruction, it was philosophy. Montgomery was not trying to save the German army. He was trying to avoid a costly mistake, but his methodical pace created time, and in war, time is often the most valuable resource of all, especially to an enemy desperate to survive. Inside the German command structure, the reality was already clear. Field Marshal Walter Model, responsible for holding the Ardennes, understood that the offensive had failed. The longer his forces remained in the Bulge, the more dangerous their position became. Fuel was running out, units were exhausted, air cover was non-existent. What remained of Germany's mobile strength was exposed and vulnerable. Model did what a professional commander was supposed to do. He asked for permission to withdraw. The request was denied. From Berlin came the familiar order: hold ground, no retreat. Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated from reality, believed that endurance itself would produce a miracle. He convinced himself that the Allies would fracture, that weather would intervene, that resolve alone could reverse the situation. The result was not defense, it was paralysis. German units remained in place too long, then withdrew too late. When retreat finally became unavoidable, it happened under pressure, without coordination, and along narrow frozen roads already under Allied fire. Heavy tanks designed for open maneuver became liabilities, clogging routes and consuming fuel that no longer existed. This was no longer an organized withdrawal, it was survival. By denying retreat when it still mattered, Hitler ensured that when it came, it would be chaotic, destructive, and irreversible. The German army was not escaping the Ardennes, it was bleeding out of it. While the German withdrawal unraveled from within, pressure was building from the south. George Patton's Third Army was moving north, not with a formal encirclement plan, but with relentless momentum. Patton understood the limits of the situation. He knew the Germans were already pulling back and that the chance for a clean, decisive trap was slipping away. But he also knew something just as important. A retreat under constant pressure is never clean. Speed, even without closure, could still be lethal. Patton drove his army hard. Infantry advanced through frozen fields and shattered villages. Artillery followed close behind, pounding road networks, bridges, and choke points. German units attempting to withdraw found themselves compressed, delayed, and forced into predictable routes where firepower could be concentrated. This was not pursuit in the classic sense, it was compression. Every mile Patton gained narrowed the space the Germans had to move. Every delay turned traffic into congestion. Heavy equipment was abandoned not because it had been destroyed, but because it could no longer be moved. Units dissolved into fragments, then into columns of men on foot. Eisenhower may have accepted retreat. Patton made sure it was costly. Without a trap, without a dramatic encirclement, the Third Army helped turn withdrawal into attrition. The Germans were not being chased out of the Ardennes, they were being squeezed out of it. By mid-January 1945, the shrinking Bulge had become less a battlefield than a funnel. German units were no longer maneuvering west, they were trying to escape east, and the focal point of that escape was the ruined town of Houffalize. Houffalize mattered because it sat astride the main road network linking the northern and southern halves of the German salient. If Allied forces linked up there, the Bulge would be cut in two, not trapped completely, but broken. On January 16th, elements of Patton's Third Army advancing from the south finally met units of the U.S. First Army pushing down from the north. The link-up was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There were no speeches, no celebrations, just exhausted soldiers recognizing each other in the rubble. Militarily, the result was decisive. The German army was not encircled in a classic sense. Thousands had already escaped, but what remained west of Houffalize was now fragmented, disorganized, and doomed. Command cohesion collapsed, supply disappeared, organized resistance faded into isolated pockets. The Bulge was severed. What followed was no longer a battle for initiative. It was the end of an army's ability to function as one. By the time the Ardennes fighting faded in late January 1945, the question of victory was no longer in doubt. The German offensive had failed. The Allied front was restored. The road into Germany stood open. But the way it ended mattered. Eisenhower had accepted the idea of retreat, believing that pressure and stability would achieve the strategic goal without risking catastrophe. Montgomery applied that pressure carefully, prioritizing control over speed. Patton drove from the south, ensuring that withdrawal came at a brutal cost. And Hitler, by denying retreat when it still mattered, turned defeat into destruction. No single commander planned what followed, yet together their decisions produced it. The German army lost as many as 100,000 men in the Ardennes, along with most of its remaining tanks and aircraft. More importantly, it lost the ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations in the west. What escaped the Bulge did so weakened, scattered, and short of equipment, unable to stop the advance that would soon cross the Rhine. For the Allies, the price was immense. Over 75,000 American casualties in a battle that was supposed to be over by Christmas. The Ardennes became the bloodiest engagement in U.S. Army history, not because retreat was forbidden, but because it was delayed. The Battle of the Bulge is often remembered as a defensive victory. In reality, it ended as something darker, a collapse born of hesitation, ideology, and pressure applied too late and too relentlessly. So the question remains, if retreat is allowed, but denied by belief, who is responsible for the slaughter that follows?